If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this. Hikers, what has been the most scariest thing you've seen in the woods? So, before I get into this, I need to throw a disclaimer out there that I was 18 years old when this event took place. I have never done hard drugs in my life, I don't drink alcohol, and I started smoking weed when I was 22. Also, there were 3 other teenagers with me that night who were also sober and witnessed this as well. So, my friend and I were hanging out with 2 of her guy friends Friday night after school, and the plans were that we were having a sleepover at my friend's house. We were just hanging out around town, nothing much to do in a small GA town, but walk around the town square and go to the trails. Well, after shooting the shit for a couple of hours, we got hungry and ordered a pizza for pickup. We got the pizza and drove to a pretty quiet neighborhood where one of the guys lived. The neighborhood was kinda tucked away into a forest, so it was really quiet and really dark in that area of town. As we were sitting there outside, eating pizza, using the hood of the car as a makeshift table, I looked up and saw what looked like a large, pitch black mass that resembled a primate in shape and movement, swinging high in the trees that had to be a good 800 feet away from us. Even from that distance, in the night, it looked so huge. But that made no sense as we live in a small town in GA. There are no large primates here. I alerted everyone to this figure in the trees, and we were all baffled and amazed at what we were seeing. I remember just having this sense of dread washing over me as I looked at this figure, trying to make sense of what I'm seeing. Then, it seemed like it noticed us. We couldn't see any distinct features, and the figure was pitch black, but somehow, you just knew that it was watching you. Suddenly, this shadow, ape-like figure stood tall, and you could almost see it shifting before your eyes, as it began to resemble more closely the shape of a large man, holding onto a branch with one arm, just staring at us with unseen eyes. Everyone was frozen, so still, and so quiet. It seemed like the sounds of the night froze in place with us. We were just transfixed on this dark figure in the trees. Then, this creature crouched over, and as it did, its shoulders seemed to stretch impossibly higher, reaching over its head. All of us were in shock and terrified at seeing this, maybe a little in denial as what we were seeing was defying any logical explanation. Because you want this to make sense. And then this. Creature's shoulders, for lack of a better word or better way to explain this, seemed to just grow into these huge wings. Then this dark figure jumped off the branch and flew off. I knew what I was seeing was real because when that happened, we all ran to the car without talking, just screaming, as fast as possible, and sped away from there. We were all freaking out, trying to find any logical reason that could explain what we had just witnessed, but there was none. Needless to say, no one slept that night. We were all too terrified that maybe that thing follow us back to my friend's house. I should also mention this was back in 2010, so no good camera phones to capture whatever we saw back then. This was 2 decades ago. They used to do donkey tours in the Grand Canyon. You ride the donkey and then hike. You can camp, but we did the day tour. A woman that was probably in her late 60s/early 70s was in front of me and on an incline started to act strange. She was swaying left and right as on a steep cliff which was very safe and wide. It swayed back and forth for maybe a minute and she was slumped over and then boom, it looked like she passed out and pulled the donkey to the left and fell over the cliff. I saw her tumble over and then they were just gone. I can't remember how far down the fall was, but it had to be over 100 feet. Immediately the guy jumped off at the front, ran over and let out an audible scream before stopping after realizing she had a tour with her. A few people got off their donkey and she stopped them from peering over. A few of the other guides looked over and they made some radio calls and then we proceeded. It was very obvious that something really serious had happened, but we never found out. I'm pretty sure I watched a woman and a donkey fall to their death in the Grand Canyon. I'm a scout and we have 1 to 2 monthly hikes. Here are by far the 2 scariest. We were hiking to get to a little cave area, rented and with multiple staff. On the 32 kilometers way we had to walk through both a city and about 20 kilometers of that road was through a very tight forest. Since we have been walking in the dark before, that didn't really scare anyone. Until we got to the end of the city, nothing happened. But me and 2 other people who had the back of the line noticed a man, I would say in the 40-50s, following us from a distance. We thought he was just on a walk and happened to be going through the city the same road we were taking. But when we got to the end of the city, we noticed that he kept following us from a good 50 meters distance. We didn't tell anybody to not scare people. We had kids as young as 10 to 11 with us. We just kinda speeded up to get the rest of us to walk a little faster. About 8 to 10 kilometers later the man is still following, but now through the forest. This time about 20 meters from us. We told everyone to speed up, and they could hear the slight fear in our voice. The man then disappeared. When the leaders asked why we were scared, we just blamed it on the cold weather and us freezing. Only me and the 2 other back troops knew. We never told anybody before about the last day of camp. It was a week-long camp with a hike included. This one probably isn't as scary for some, but one night we were a few older scouts 14 to 16 years old were out alone with just a single leader on a small little trip, just us alone. We had a lot of fun and we were just chilling around the campfire until about 12 p.m. We went to bed about 1 a.m. About 3 a.m. I woke up very thirsty. I was looking for my water dunk when I heard heavy breathing close to our tent, probably 5 to 10 meters away. I laid down as silent as possible, scared as duck, not making a single noise. The breathing noise went away and I just laid in the tent, scared. Just before I was about to fall asleep again, I heard a blood-freezing scream. Animalic scream. It wasn't very loud, so it was probably far away. One other person woke slightly up, but I guess they didn't really hear it. I laid 2 and 2 together and realized that the heavy breathing and the scream probably came from the same thing. And it couldn't have been a cougar. It was in Denmark, with no cougars and such. I sat thinking about it for about an hour before falling asleep. I was just too tired. When we woke up at 9, I looked around the tent looking for footsteps. I found nothing, and blamed it on my imagination. I still don't know what it could have been or if it was just my imagination. I've never experienced anything weird after that. 2010 Woods of Arkansas. Still to this day my friends and I get chills talking about it. About 5 or 6 of us were smoking in the back of my buddy's F-150 and pulled into a random spot off of some backwoods in Ozark, Arkansas. I'm talking population of like 1,500 people. I just recently moved there from a big city and didn't know much about animals at that age, 16 years/0. About 15 minutes of us being in these random ass woods, I saw a set of eyes staring at us. Not knowing much, I just thought it was an animal or something in the woods. Like an owl, because it was about 10 or 12 feet in the air. But it didn't blink. Getting ducking goosebumps writing this, after looking at it for about a good 30 seconds or so of this thing not blinking, and me slowly focusing on it, I noticed it didn't have pupils either. Still, not freaking out yet, I point through the stoned laughs and conversation at the thing looking sts. I'm laughing too, like, what is that? They have all lived there for a long or all their lives, so I figured one of them would know. Dead silence, nothing, I mean there is not a single sound. No lights are on, so it is pitch black out there. Just lighters being alight. These eyes were glowing yellow and not moving. Not blinking. A good 10 seconds go by, which felt like 10 minutes. I swear on my life this thing went from being maybe 50 to 60 feet away to 15 feet away behind a tree in less than a second. My buddy threw some salsa that we were munching on at it. And instantly we ducking all freaked out. Sounds ducking goofy AF, but it ducking teleported instantly. It didn't make a sound and a flash of second moved, the eyes glue in the dark. We all saw that shit and there was no explanation. I have even looked up to see if there is any animals that it could be, and possibly a bird or squirrel, and there is nothing. But, my buddy looked it up recently after telling him this story and found that there is a myth about a creature with yellow eyes out near that area. I was camping in a remote area with my friends when we saw something incredibly creepy. We had just finished setting up our tents and starting a fire when we heard some rustling in the bushes nearby. At first, we thought it might be a small animal, but the sounds were too heavy and deliberate. As we watched, a tall, thin figure emerged from the trees. It was walking on 2 legs, but its gait was strange and lurching. It had long, spindly arms that reached almost to the ground, and its fingers looked like they could wrap all the way around a tree trunk. We were frozen in fear, watching as the figure slowly made its way towards us. As it got closer, we could see that it had a humanoid face, but its eyes were completely black, without any whites or pupils. It didn't make any noise, but we could feel a sense of dread emanating from it. Finally, it stopped about 20 feet away from us, just beyond the edge of the firelight. It stood there for what felt like an eternity, just watching us with those blank, black eyes. Then, without warning, it turned and disappeared back into the woods. We were all shaken up and couldn't sleep for the rest of the night. To this day, we have no idea what we saw, but we all agree that it was the creepiest thing any of us have ever experienced. So about 5 years ago, a friend and I were hiking in the Oregon Cascades in the mid-spring. We were about 6 miles in from the road, nowhere near a trail on about 6 feet of snow. We were going out for 5 days to attempt to summit a few peaks, so we looked like grizzly mountain men. Around a tree comes 2 guys and a dog. Mid-50s, his son mid-20s, and Fifi. They are wearing trail running shorts, running shoes and a running water backpack. AKA, nothing of real use. PCT open? They asked. Friend and I looked at each other, looked at them, tried not to laugh and explained. We are 5 miles from the PCT and 2,000 feet lower in elevation. What are you trying to do? They planned on doing a 20-mile run along the PCT starting on the other side of the mountains but got sidetracked due to snow. Again we explain that they are ducked. I tell them that there is a road with cell service 6 miles downhill along our tracks and if need be we can hike them out. They refused and asked if the PCT was open again. I flat out told them you are ducked, let me hike you out. They were like nah, we've got this, and ran off in the wrong direction. We camped there for the night and followed their tracks for a half mile the next morning. They disappeared, no signs of them. After a few stormy days and failed summit attempts we hiked out. I drove around to the parking area they mentioned and looked through the wilderness permit tags to try to find a name. Nothing. It gets weird though. A few years later, my parents ran into the same nondescript people in the same area again asking about a trail loop, same conditions. Late winter, snowshoeing far from a road and they were lost. My dad also tried to hike them out but they denied and took off in the wrong direction. He followed their tracks for a half mile before he lost them. So if anyone sees the ghosts of the Oregon Cascades, let me know. When I was a teenager we went away for a week of camping at the Scout Reserve. My dad was our scoutmaster and we were mostly all friends from growing up. There was one kid, Andre, the youngest, that we didn't really know well and was definitely kind of weird, withdrawn and awkward, just kinda different, but still a sweet guy that everyone liked. Toward the end of the week we went out on an overnight, just the scouts without my dad or his buddy who was our other scouter. We took a boat across the lake and then hiked for hours into the bush. It was a really hot day and my older brother was leading us but not drinking any water and wearing a light jacket which made him extra hot. Eventually we found a sweet spot next to a huge cliff which we jumped off into the lake below for hours until we made a fire and cooked dinner. Eventually we all fell asleep under the stars. Around 4:30 a.m., just before sunrise, my friend Sean woke me up and asked if I knew where Andre was. I said no and that maybe he went to piss, but after 5 minutes he wasn't back so we got up and started looking around and calling his name. Nothing. So we ranged a little further and then I saw his sleeping bag at the edge of the cliff. I freaked out and ran over to see if I could see anything at the bottom, but I saw nothing. We tried to get my brother up but he was pretty sick from heat stroke so I took charge of the situation. We started ranging out into the woods and calling his name. The guy started doing the emergency whistle call, 3 short whistles, but we were really in the middle of nowhere. I started going deeper into the woods calling his name. Then I thought I heard something. I stopped and listened and heard a faint cry deep in the woods. So I started running, crashing through thick undergrowth, getting lashed in the face with branches and stumbling across fallen logs. His cries got louder and eventually I arrived to this huge clearing in the woods to find him sitting on a fallen tree, in his underwear and a t-shirt. He said he'd been there for hours, having woken up on the ground in the dark and having no idea where he was so he just sat it out, waiting for dawn. It was really spooky. The craziest thing was that his watch had been reset so he didn't know what time it actually was. We all accepted that it was probably sleepwalking, but he was so far in the woods and didn't have a scratch on him, and this clearing was so bizarre because it was big and round in the middle of these really dense woods. To this day I wonder what really happened. I saw an opossum smear itself, predator style, in the rotting remains of another dead animal, pretty sure it was another opossum. Kind of cheating in that he was an opossum we had rehabilitated and had just released. I named him Odin because he had lost an eye to a dog attack, but gained a kick-ass scar in the process. He was absolutely the most vicious, metal possum I ever had the pleasure of knowing, and the only way to calm down his Tasmanian devil ass was with lunch meat slices. Possums rub on / cover themselves with scents they like. Once in the wild, he immediately chose death. As someone who wants the animals to go back to the wild, this was all wonderful to see. I like to think he's still out there, murdering backpackers and campers for their lunch meat. I was solo hiking in familiar territory in a state park in northern Illinois. Went to check my phone for a map cause I got turned around and realized it had died, so at this point I'm a little worried but not really. The sun wasn't setting for another 3 to 4 hours. Decided to take liberty to explore, and came across a tight path leading into what I thought was a clearing. The clearing consisted of waist-high grass, with trees scattered around. Every branch about 10 to 15 feet up the trees was broken off, and very neatly constructed into an arch about 8 feet high. I could stand under it and reach my arms up and couldn't touch it. Right next to it was a hut, I could stand in that too, no problem. No signs of encampment, or old fires, no trash. And no other paths leading out of the clearing outside of the one I came from. The whole vibe was very eerie. Wish I had taken pictures or marked the location but my phone was dead. Went back the next day to see if I could retrace my steps and couldn't find it. Haven't been able to make my way back there since. Hiking in Japan, went up to a trio of mountains to see the 3 correlating shrines, each a bit more remote and trail more treacherous than the last. They weren't that dangerous, but the final trail had a sheer drop you edged past by holding a chain nailed into the cliff. Came down the last mountain on what I would now consider to be the wrong side. I was coming down an old service road and there was clear evidence of landslides. Wasn't too worried about it that particular day because it had been dry for weeks. Anyway, get roughly to the base of this mountain and can only describe what I walked through as a shanty town, but the boxes and sheet metal the houses were built from were basically more spread apart. I guess it was more of a camp than a town. Anyway, the service road was dotted with these constructions for about 100 meters or so. No one was outside, but you know how you can sort of sense eyes on you? Yeah. I did actually spot a couple pairs of eyes peering out at me once or twice. It definitely felt like I was somewhere I wasn't supposed to be. Plus it was getting dark and I was racing back to the bus stop. Since it was fairly remote, it only came once every several hours. I ended up beating feet out of there, but it was a very weird, eerie experience. I can only guess I had stumbled upon some kind of homeless population that had holed up in what appeared to be an old campground. There were very poorly maintained pagodas and restrooms nearby as well as fire pits. I later did some very cursory digging to see what I could find out about the area, but it didn't really produce anything. The right side of the mountain was a cozy little riverside village. You'd never guess that its polar opposite was just on the other side of a mountain. Was all very bizarre. It's all kind of a fever dream of a memory. So I was hiking in north central Pa forest country with my girlfriend. Weekend hike. Like 30 miles. In the middle of an absolutely black moonless night I couldn't sleep. She was lightly sleeping next to me. I was lying there listening to the sounds of the woods with my eyes open or closed. It was the same either way. Then, I saw a light moving in the distance through the Cuban mesh tent fabric. It was a small dim light that looked like a flashlight being carried. I thought it might be a park ranger. I see those guys from time to time. I thought it might be a night hiker. I do that sometimes. I had no idea what it was, but I was absolutely certain it was headed towards us. The light followed a roughly wave-shaped path through the trees, meandering slowly in our direction. I called out to it and woke up my girlfriend. I shouted, "Hey!" and stuff like that. I verified with her that we were both awake and both seeing the same thing. It moved silently. There is no question that whatever it is, it knows we are there and absolutely is coming over to inspect us. I was freaking out a little. Shouting, "Go away," she yelled at it. I was too chicken shit to unzip the tent and confront it. I'm not kidding you. I was terrified. The light approached the tent, did a circle around us, and left. The way out came, floating up and down, snaking its way back into the forest without a sound. We were completely shaken by the experience, but it was over and we had zero answers. After the hike we asked the rangers at the station if anyone had reported seeing floating lights, but they just looked at us like we were high. Sober as a judge the whole trip. For 2 years I sat with that experience in my brain. Until it happened again. Same girlfriend. Same tent. Same time of night. Different forest, still north central Pa. Same kind of weekend loop hike. We saw it again. Through the thin fabric of our tent the light was blurry but unmistakable. And again it floated towards us. Up and down. Then it made contact. It landed on the tent. It was a firefly. It had always been a firefly. Sometimes fireflies leave their butts on for extended periods of time when they're lost and searching for others. My tent had reflectors on the zippers and lines. The bugs saw their own reflection and came to investigate. For 2 years I thought I had seen the supernatural. I walked down a random trail near another more well-known trail system called the Shed Pond Loop, in Maine. I came across this custom-made sign that gave me some Stephen King vibes, hand-painted, almost childlike in appearance, that said, "Dad's Way." I followed it and there were pretty much zero markings and it was almost entirely overgrown. Zero sounds of animals, like very eerily quiet and claustrophobic feeling the entire time. Turned around to bail when I kept seeing movement that I thought were bikers, but upon closer inspection it was just more dense woods, meaning no trail and no possible way bikers would be out there. When I turned around to bail, no sign of the trail I had been following. Followed one direction that I was certain would take me out to a road, so at this point I'm trudging through dense woods. In the middle of this random area, I come across a chair with a tree growing through it, and a few very old glass beer bottles next to it. No trail, no clearings, just in the middle of these ducking woods. Walked faster and made it out finally, but the whole thing felt so surreal. I used to do a lot of rock climbing in the Sierra Nevadas. My climbing partner and I also like to cave and just roam, check out whatever we found. We were hiking and climbing below the giant bridge in NorCal everyone base jumps from. Below it we found an abandoned mine with a concrete plug in the main entrance, but we found a path going up the hill a bit and followed it. We found an air shaft that had been opened. So we did our normal, got ropes set up and lowered ourselves in. We had headlamps and were armed, we weren't worried. We went down the tunnels checking random stuff out for 15 to 20 minutes or so, no big deal. It was pretty neat. Then it was a big deal, and not neat. We found a door cut in the rock that led to a small chamber, like 15 by 15 or something like that. The entire room was painted gold with weird symbols everywhere. There was a center rock pedestal exactly like an altar which had symbols painted on it as well. Circles with lines through them and dots, just weird symbols, nothing I could tie to any religion I'm aware of. There was dried blood everywhere. It dries like a brownish red and it was everywhere. On the stone in the center, all over the walls, everywhere. The room was completely clean otherwise, no rock rubble, trash, paint cans, nothing. Like it had been swept. We looked at each other, said "Oh duck no," and got the duck out of there. We tried to tell the authorities but they either didn't believe us or they didn't want to go down there. We never went back. Was hiking in Cape Scott Provincial Park, British Columbia, Canada, on a trail that doesn't get much traffic. The trail was an out and back to a beautiful beach. There were many different terrains we crossed, beaches, a small mountain, meadows, swamps, and rivers. The rivers we had to ford at low tide going in. On the way out we missed low tide by about an hour and the rivers were way higher than we had wanted, but we crossed the first one without too much issue. We then crossed through some forest, maybe about 200 yards, quite possibly much less, and made it to the second river. We looked across for our trail marker and couldn't find it. We had somehow missed the trail and made our own, though it was obvious we weren't the only ones who had been that way. We trekked back to the first river to start the trail again, but we came out at the same place and still couldn't find the trail marker. I think we ended up trying to find this marker for 2 hours. I wasn't worried, we had plenty of gear and food still, and honestly I was ready to just hike down to the ocean and back up the other side of the river to comb for the trail marker. All of a sudden we heard voices coming from the direction that we thought the marker should be. We started shouting toward them but they didn't respond. We hiked toward the voices and immediately found the marker. We couldn't find whoever the voices belonged to, and as we hiked our way out we realized there had been no one else out there at all. Only our own footprints in the mud. People decided to have a campfire in a forest near the shore about a 20 minutes drive from my house. We go to that spot very often during summer and we're used to hearing weird noises from time to time, but we usually just brush it off and assume it's a raccoon and we just turn up the music a little and go back to our conversation. At a certain point, one of my friends, let's call her Ro, decided we were gonna go buy hot dog sausages to eat around the fire. So we start walking on the trail to get to the road where my car was parked and we started chatting at the same time. Suddenly we hear a voice making a sound like woo-woo. The pitch was a little high, kinda like a teenage girl, but it was also a little distorted. Ro looks at me and says something along the lines of "Yo, that was weird, it sounded like a bird trying to imitate a human." At that point we were far from the rest of the group already, so it couldn't have been them. We couldn't hear the music coming from the speaker, let alone hear their voices, so we knew it wasn't them. My thoughts instantly go to the theory that it could be a skinwalker. I was obsessed with creepy encounters and unexplainable events on Reddit or YouTube a few years back, so of course I've heard of skinwalkers. But Ro has never heard of them and isn't really into creepy stuff in general. I keep my mouth shut to not scare her even more and we keep walking to my car. We eventually get back with the sausages and start walking down the trail to get back to our friends. Suddenly Ro jumps and goes on, "What was that?" She explains that she just saw something, it was like a dog but it didn't have fur. That's when I lost it. I told her to walk faster and proceeded to explain to her what a skinwalker is, as accurately as I could with what I remembered. She freaks out and as soon as we get back to our friends she tries to tell them what happened, but one of them cuts her off, scared, and basically tells us he thought we were over there, something like 4 meters away, because they saw a person standing there and tried to talk to them, think it was us, but got no response and assumed we were pranking them. After sharing our story as well, he took out his axe, that he uses to cut up the wood for the fire, and we stayed there. In the end nothing else happened and we were fine. Part of me thinks that she saw a coyote because there's a sign at the entrance of the forest warning people of the presence of coyotes in that forest. I've personally never seen any because I never really go there alone and we make a lot of noise talking and listening to music, so I think it might scare them a little. Another reason why everyone was freaked out is because, about a week before, the local police had found an abandoned burnt car with an unidentified body in the trunk in the area. Which is also why we always walked around in groups of 2 or 3. Skinwalker or not, that voice we heard was definitely super creepy. A completely pitch black figure standing about 10 feet in front of me. I stopped walking, saw it for about 4 to 5 seconds before it vanished. I was oddly not scared at all, and decided to continue to walk up the trail. Well, I walked to where it was, and this time it appeared to me in my imagination/mind's eye. I stopped walking again. Pitch black figure, except for this time it had eyes that looked scared/wide open. It was also hyperventilating, scared, looking at me. When it disappeared, I decided to turn back. I only began to take this seriously when I saw a video on YouTube about someone else seeing the shadow figure in the same small state park. Then I got chills that pulsated through my body, and I was frozen for a few minutes. It had become real for me. I tried hiking the same trail months later, before seeing the YouTube video, and a fly flew in my ear, so I had to turn back, go home, and get some oil to put in my ear so I could drown it so it would stop buzzing, and then I had to go to the doctor for them to remove it. I finally got the message and have never been past a certain point on the Panther Branch Trail. Not quite hiking, but in August of 2019, I loaded a bunch of camping gear onto my bicycle and spent the better part of the next 7 months riding 5,300 miles around the US. I most often preferred to wild camp, so rather than staying in proper campgrounds, I would just find a place to disappear into the woods for the night. In late September, I was wild camping somewhere in rural Montana. I was quite a ways out there, far from the nearest town. I went off into the woods and set up camp. After using the last few minutes of sunlight to eat some dinner, brush my teeth, and write in my journal, I laid down to get some sleep. Over the past month or so of sleeping in the woods, I had grown very accustomed to the nighttime sounds of the forest. The chirping of crickets and croaking of toads can be quite loud. There was always at least a slight breeze rustling the leaves of the trees. It was always a highlight of my night, though not particularly uncommon, to hear the distant yips and howls of coyotes, and one night I was very excited to hear 2 owls, one on either side of my tent, hooting back and forth. So that one night in Montana, it was quite alarming to be surrounded by a completely silent forest. There was not a single sound to be heard. Even the air was dead still, with no breeze to rustle the dry leaves of autumn still clinging to the trees. And it was honestly terrifying. On that night, there would occasionally be the snapping of a twig or some other such sound that normally would be lost in the other commotion. But that night, there was no background noise to mask the few sounds that did pop up, and so all of those little twig snapping type things seemed 100 times louder. On that trip, I slept in some very loud places, like the night I pitched my tent right next to some train tracks that ended up being much more active than I thought. I shared a hostel room with a guy who snored and a bunkmate who talked in his sleep. Both in the same night. But that night of absolute silence in the woods of Montana was the worst night of sleep of the entire 179-day trip. It was the loudest silence I've ever heard, and that absolutely terrified me. Some background: I live in the mountains, so I hike a lot. My partner and I normally hike together, but sometimes we split up where my partner will run up to a predetermined point on the trail while I hike up. I have asthma, so running is not something I can do anymore. My partner normally waits for me at the predetermined spot, and we either hike down together or keep hiking up together. One morning we went before work and split up. The plan was for my partner to wait for me halfway up the trail. While I was hiking, I felt on edge. This trail runs through the forest for a long way, and normally you hear lots of birds and squirrels, but this time it was silent. I get anxious at times, so I chalked it up to that and kept going. I get to a turn in the trail where I'm hiking past a lot of low brush and I hear what sounds like a growl. Still thinking I'm just freaking myself out, I clear my throat very loudly in case there is something I can't see. I will startle it out of the brush. Nothing moves, so I keep going. I get maybe 100 feet further and I run into my partner running down the trail. They look frightened and just say there's a cougar. Turns out my partner decided they didn't want to wait for me, so they had started hiking back down the trail towards me. They rounded a curve and found a cougar standing in the middle of the trail sniffing at something. It jumped when it saw my partner and took off down the trail towards where I was hiking. We made it back without incident, and I'll never know for sure, but I think I walked right by a cougar in the brush. We've hiked that trail many times since, and we've even seen cougar prints in the snow a few times. We no longer split up while hiking, and when it feels too quiet, we turn around and hike home. I don't know if folks will consider this scary, but this happened to me as a young kid. I grew up in a rural area of NJ. Hunterdon County, a little town called Reddington. My family had 14 acres, mostly forested. Some Scotch and white pines and spruces we had planted, and then a lot of hardwoods. This included a lot of mulberry trees from when they tried to make a silk-producing area. Anyways, I lived there from the year before kindergarten until 8th grade. I grew up in the forests. I would go hiking with my dad all the time, and we crossed into other properties, and then by myself a lot. So I was very familiar with the territory. One time, I was following the creek on our property. Downstream it led to Holland Brook, which eventually found its way to the Raritan River. I had followed it a few times and always came to the same spring. But this time, there was a different set of shale cutouts. It really freaked me out. I had traced this creek a number of times. This wasn't an offshoot. I had to cross a number of property lines, as evidenced by the number of barbed wire fences I climbed through, and finally, when I got to the head of the creek, there was a place with about 8 different animal skulls. I knew some were deer, some were groundhogs. There was one really weird big one I think at the time was some feral hog looking back. I was afraid to touch any of them. I remember instantly feeling watched. I got my back to a tree. I think I was about 9 at this time, maybe 10, and always took either a machete or hatchet with me when playing in the woods per my dad's instructions. I waited, listening, and hearing nothing. None of the birds, the rattle of leaves from small mammals moving, or even snakes. We had a lot of copperheads on our property. My dad sold cut firewood. I used to have to split logs and they were always by wood piles. I finally gathered myself up and slowly worked my way home. I remember stopping at our barn, which was at the bottom of a little hillside/cliff from the house, and waiting in the loft, just seeing if anything in the woods was moving/following me. My horses, 1 quarter horse, 1 Arabian, and a Shetland for my sister, and goats all came into the barn, which was not typical in the daytime. But it could have been because I was in the barn, but I remember thinking it was weird. Finally, after about 30 minutes, I went up to the house, but I remember for a few days after that feeling being watched whenever I was down by the animals in the barn. I also never found that same clearing again, and I tried. It happened when me and my parents were on vacation to some place near Spain when I was still little. We went to a little beach at some coastal town where I then immediately jumped into the sea with my swimming goggles on. I then crawled onto some rocks and walked around until I noticed a crab sitting on the rocks. I then traversed them carefully while trying to catch it, but it kept crawling away. This continued until I then followed it to a point where the little bay I was in ended and the open ocean began. So then little me decided that it was a good idea to jump into the open water to see if there was anything cool down there. I then jumped in, and I was immediately hit with the cold temperature of actual ocean water. But the worst part was that even with my goggles on, I couldn't see anything down there. I was met with a giant black void. No fish, no plants, no rocks. Nothing. I then immediately turned around and began swimming back as quick as I could. And since that moment I haven't gone beyond the shallows ever again. I once worked as a housing inspector. A new client had purchased a house and I was tasked to go and inspect it. From the information on hand, the house was a very old home, built 1908, and was quite the derelict. I was in no hurry to inspect the house in my honest opinion, so scheduled it for my last stop of the day. I did my jobs as per normal and then made my way to the house. I parked my car on the road and as I walked up the path, nothing extraordinary jumped out at me. It was a run-down 3-story house. For me, it was just your run-of-the-mill wreck. I guess the buyers had walked through and seen some potential in the home, but I could see none. It was getting on to dusk and as I didn't have the key for the front door, I made my way around to the rear of the property to access the rear door. As I came around the back of the house I noticed that the back door itself opened up into a large kitchen. What caught me at that point in time was, as the sun began to set behind me, I could feel a drastic change of air temperature. It was late summer and I assumed this was the reason for the drop in temp. I turned to look at the sunset, noting that the cloud cover gave the sky a nice crimson hue. I turned back towards the door and that's when I saw it. On the other side of the kitchen was a door that led into a hallway which in turn led to the front door. The front door had colored glass. But what was standing in the darkness of the hallway, to this day, still makes the hair of my neck stand up. There was a silhouette of man. Judging from the build, I could tell it was a man. There was no distinguishable features to see, just a black silhouette. What happened next froze me to the spot. Where his face was, 2 eyes opened. And they were the color red. Unblinking and unmoving, those eyes glowed red and I could tell they were looking right at me. At first I couldn't look away. Those red orbs seemed to stare straight into my soul and I found myself transfixed staring back. Every fiber in me told me I should run but I could not move. I stared unblinking at the red eyes and they in turn stared unblinking back at me. My eyes began to water and I blinked to clear them, but as I opened my eyes again, the silhouette was gone. I freaked. I quickly ran around the house, jumped in my car and sped home. What would normally take me 25 minutes to drive home, only took me 10 as I couldn't get away fast enough. In my report I wrote that the house and some structural issues that could not be remedied, and the house was eventually torn down. In its place is now a housing unit with 6 3-bedroom homes. I have heard stories from tradesmen who have been on site at night, and all have said that they felt a cold chill every time they go there. I did look up the history of the property, but nothing unusual jumped out at me. Up to that point in my life, I never believed in the supernatural or the paranormal. Even now I am skeptical of most things. But I know what I saw was pure evil, and I have never had an encounter like it since. I grew up in rural Appalachia, so I grew up hearing all kinds of superstitions and legends about ghosts and other creepy things. Of course, as an adult I realized they were mostly made up by people trying to scare their kids from wandering off into the woods and passed down over the generations. I was told to never respond if something called my name in the woods, and if we heard whistling outside at night it meant the devil was close. Of course there's real truth and valuable advice in some of those stories. If a stranger is calling to you in the woods or whistling outside your house at night, you probably should be afraid, especially as a child. I never experienced either there in the mountains. The scariest thing that ever happened to me wasn't supernatural and happened in New Mexico. My mom died when I was very little, and when I was 20 my dad passed away, leaving me without immediate family except my brother. Dad didn't have much, but he left his house to my brother and just enough money to me that I was able to buy 2 acres and a nice used camper. My boyfriend, now my husband, wanted to move back home and be close to his mom, and we planned to eventually build a house. It seemed like such a cool adventure to me at the time. It was literally in the desert, a dirt lot off a dirt road with no electricity or water access and surrounded by other identical empty plots. Until very recently you could still find land like that for a little bit of nothing because it's inconvenient and expensive to truly live comfortably out there. We had to haul water from my in-laws' house and use a generator for electricity. My husband worked nights as a security guard, so I was alone in that camper almost every night. Honestly, it was boring, and it felt safe enough to me then because I had a big bear of a Rottweiler named Zeus who would have defended either of us to the death. Obviously though, as I'd find out, it wasn't really that safe, dog or not. It was a normal night like any other. I had been outside watching the sky while I smoked a bowl and came back in to get ready for bed. I had just undressed and climbed into bed when I heard whistling and felt the camper sort of shift like a hard gust of wind hit it. It wasn't that unusual because sometimes the wind blew really hard out there, so I would have ignored it if Zeus hadn't started growling like the devil himself was outside. He was crouched down toward the doorway ready to attack. I was terrified, and it suddenly seemed so foolish to have assumed I was safe out there alone with a thin aluminum door between me and whoever/whatever was out there in the dark. I couldn't help but think about the story my granddad told me all those years ago about hearing whistling at night, and while I'm not very religious in general, I'd be lying if I said it wasn't pretty unnerving in that moment. The sound of it was so unnaturally high-pitched that it almost sounded like the wind, but not quite, because it had a sort of sad melody to it. Besides that, my dog had never growled at the wind before. I remember thinking how crazy it was I could hear it over the generator and I couldn't tell where it was coming from. It sounded like it was everywhere. I tried to work up the courage to peek outside, but I was frozen to the bed. Zeus was going crazy now, growling and snarling and pacing. He rarely barked, but when he did it was intimidating as hell, and once he started barking at the wall like he was possessed, everything sort of stopped. It was like the tension in the air just slowly dissipated. Zeus was just as freaked out as me and couldn't settle down until I finally let him outside about an hour later. He sniffed the back of the camper where the bedroom was for a good minute before reluctantly turning away and coming back inside, but I was too chicken shit to go outside myself. Cell service was spotty. This was a long time ago when everyone still had flip phones, and I was without a way to leave or call for help. When I told my husband the next morning, he was convinced it was traffickers or worse trying to break in on me, and Zeus had scared them off. It was somewhat plausible to me, but I didn't feel that was the explanation. No one had actually tried to break in. That would be some strange kidnappers, to just stand outside whistling. Then he told me he'd heard rumors of a small cult who lived somewhere out there, and maybe it was some of them trying to scare us away. That was more terrifying to me in a way, since I figured if that was the case they might come back, but in the daylight with my husband there it also seemed a bit silly. I remembered how Zeus was sniffing the back of the camper, and we decided to go look around. The dirt out there is soft and sandy and looked like it had been trampled around in by multiple people with different sized bare feet. The dirt that was right under the small window over our bed. The weirdest part is how there were no tracks leading off in any other direction away from the camper, just the ones outside the window and one set halfway around the backside wall, right around where Zeus had started barking. Suddenly that crazy cult rumor didn't seem very far-fetched or silly to me, and that's how I ended up living with my mother-in-law for over a year, because duck living in fear of being harassed or worse. We still own the lot where that happened, but we bought a place in town. The desert is beautiful and I love hiking in it with other people, but at the same time I've noticed something about it also really seems to attract crazy folks. Hiking through the backwoods and came across a patch of about 2 acres of long-dead trees, free of undergrowth outside of the corpses of thorn bushes. Everything in the meadow was dead, but there were no signs of fire and the field was full of old wood. In the center was a desiccated gnarly old tree. On that tree was a goat skull sticking out of a straitjacket full of animal bones, which had been nailed to the tree. There was a huge copperhead sunbathing next to it, so I decided to beat a hasty retreat. It always creeped me out. There wasn't anything of interest nearby other than a small swamp a mile or two away from this odd dead clearing. Who hiked into the woods to set up such a macabre totem? I go on month-long canoe trips in northern Ontario every summer. In 2021 we were canoeing across the James Bay, in order to get to the town of Moosonee where we would take the train back down the province. There were no logging roads, no bridges, and only the occasional off-grid hunting cabin. It was around 9 o'clock at night and we were about 20 kilometers from the mouth of the bay. Everyone was asleep to catch the tide in the morning, so I was the only one out watching the water move. The moon was very bright and there was no cloud cover. I heard a whistling noise and looked up to see a shiny cylindrical object flying overhead. It dipped quickly and plunged into the river. It wasn't very big and looked about the size of a paper towel roll. It shot back out of the water a few seconds later and instantly accelerated to the speed of sound. It made sonic boom and I could see it relenting the moon before it went out of sight. It kinda made me cry because it felt so special. I have no idea what it was, but I was the only one who saw it. It was in the right place at the right time. Everyone else who woke up from the boom thought there was a hunter nearby. I never told anyone about this.